Under the blazing suns of the alien city, the streets were alive with noise and movement. Traders shouted over the hum of strange beasts pulling carts. The smell of spiced food drifted through the air, and soldiers in crimson armor patrolled. With heavy steps, in the middle of this chaos, a human named Kale walked with quiet purpose. His bare chest glistened with sweat, and his sharp eyes missed nothing. He had been in this city only 3 days, but already he could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Near the center of the market, an old alien woman stumbled under the weight of a golden offering bowl. Her skin was a faded blue, her hands trembling with age. The crowd parted as a shadow fell over her. A towering gladiator in ornate armor blocked her path. His massive form was covered in red-plated armor, his helmet's crest like a blade aimed at the sky. He barked words in a language Kale could barely understand, but the meaning was clear. The old woman had displeased him, and the punishment would be brutal. Kale's steps quickened. The alien crowd murmured, some turning away, others watching. With cold curiosity, the gladiator reached down, gripping the woman's arm with clawed fingers. She cried out, and the sound cut through the air like a knife. Kale didn't think, he moved. His hand caught the gladiator's wrist, the sudden force making the armored giant pause. The crowd gasped, and dozens of strange, blue-skinned faces turned toward the human who dared to interfere. The gladiator's head tilted, his voice deep and mocking. Kale didn't answer. His grip tightened, and his gaze never wavered. The old woman pulled free, clutching her bowl as she stumbled back into the safety of the crowd. The gladiator released a low growl, his breath hot and metallic. Around them, the market seemed to hold its breath. Kale could feel the weight of countless eyes pressing in on them, and among those eyes were 12 that burned with something different, something fierce and unblinking. They stood together at the edge of the market square. 12 young alien women, their flawless blue skin glowing in the sunlight, their elegant robes lined with gold thread. Each one watched him intently, their expressions unreadable, but their focus sharp. Kale didn't know them, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Behind them, the rest of the crowd whispered in hushed tones, and he caught fragments of words. Human, fool, dead. The gladiator moved first. His armored fist swung like a hammer, but Kale slipped aside, the strike smashing into the ground and sending dust into the air. Kale countered with a quick strike to the joint of the gladiator's elbow. It wasn't enough to injure, but it made the giant step back. The crowd roared, some in shock, others in excitement. The 12 women remained silent, their eyes locked on him as if measuring something unseen. A second attack came, faster this time. Kale ducked under the sweeping blow and drove his shoulder into the gladiator's chest. The force pushed them both back a step. The gladiator's growl deepened, his hands tightening on the hilt of a massive blade strapped to his side. Kale knew that if the weapon left its sheath, the fight would become far deadlier. Still, he didn't retreat. His body was tense, his senses alive, every heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then, a voice rang out from the edge of the market. Sharp and commanding, it cut through the noise. The gladiator froze, his head turning toward the source. Kale followed his gaze. One of the 12 women had stepped forward, her gold-trimmed robe catching the light, her chin raised in defiance. Her words were quick, urgent, and filled with authority. The gladiator's posture shifted, his grip loosening. Without another glance, he turned and walked away, his heavy armor clanging with each step. The crowd began to disperse, but the 12 women stayed where they were, their eyes still on Kale. He didn't know it yet, but his life in this city had just changed forever. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Kale stood unmoving as the gladiator's heavy footsteps faded into the noise of the market. The old woman he had protected was already gone, guided away by a pair of younger aliens who whispered to her in hurried tones. Kale's breathing slowed, but the tension in his body remained. Around him, the onlookers slowly returned to their business, though many kept glancing back at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. The 12 women had not moved. They stood in a perfect line, their gold-trimmed robes shifting gently with the desert breeze. Each face carried a unique beauty, sharp cheekbones, eyes like polished gems, and skin that caught the sunlight in an otherworldly way. Kale could feel their stares as clearly as if they had placed hands on his shoulders. They were not ordinary citizens. He could sense authority in the way they held themselves, and the air between them carried an unspoken weight. One of them stepped forward. Her movements were graceful but deliberate, the kind of walk that drew the gaze of everyone nearby without effort. She stopped just a few paces from Kale, her eyes scanning him from head to toe as if committing every detail to memory. Her voice, when she spoke, was low yet carried easily over the murmur of the market. She asked him why he had interfered. Kale's answer was simple, because the old woman could not defend herself. A faint smile touched her lips, but it was gone almost instantly. Another of the women joined her, this one taller with a presence that reminded Kale of a seasoned warrior. She wore a golden clasp at her shoulder, the metal etched with patterns he did not recognize. Her tone was sharper, questioning his origins, his purpose in the city, and whether he understood the risk he had taken. Kale's replies were calm, though his mind worked quickly, searching for what lay beneath their questions. It wasn't only about the fight. They wanted to know the measure of the man before them. The leader Kale suspected. She was the leader spoke again. She told him the gladiator he had faced was not a common fighter, but a champion of the city's arenas, a warrior whose victories had made him feared and respected. No one challenged him without consequence. Kale's defiance would not go unnoticed by the city's rulers, and soon the challenge would come, either in the open or from the shadows. Her eyes held his as she said this, as though testing whether fear would take root in him. Instead of fear, Kale felt a strange calm settle over him. The market noise faded into the background, replaced by the quiet awareness that he stood at a crossing point. He could walk away, disappear into the maze of streets, and avoid the danger entirely. Or he could face whatever came, knowing that running would mean living with the taste of cowardice. The choice was already made in his heart, and when he answered the woman, his voice carried the certainty of a man who had decided. The leader nodded once, a small but telling sign. She glanced at the others, and they seemed to understand without words. One by one, they stepped forward and formed a loose circle around him. The crowd that still lingered watched in silence, sensing something unusual was happening. Kale noticed that each of the women bore small marks on their wrists or necks, patterns inked into the skin, glowing faintly under the sun. Symbols of rank, perhaps, or of a shared bond he did not yet understand. Without explanation, the leader gestured for him to follow. The women began walking toward a narrow path that wound between tall stone buildings. Kale moved with them, his steps steady but his mind alert. He did not know where they were taking him, only that turning back was no longer an option. Somewhere deep within, he felt that whatever awaited him beyond this path would tie his fate to theirs in ways neither he nor they could yet imagine. The narrow path opened into a courtyard surrounded by high sandstone walls. Sunlight poured in from above, casting long shadows that stretched across the patterned stone floor. Kale noticed that no one else was here except the 12 women and himself. The noise of the market had vanished behind the thick walls, leaving only the sound of their soft footsteps and the occasional rustle of fabric. The air felt heavier here, as if it carried a history that strangers were not meant to walk through. The leader stopped near a carved archway and turned to face him. Her eyes studied him again, though this time there was less caution and more curiosity. She asked if he understood the depth of what he had done. Kale answered that he understood enough, that stepping in had likely marked him for retaliation. Her head tilted slightly at his words, as if she had expected something else. Then she gestured toward the archway, and two of the women pushed open its heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was cooler. Faint light came through slits in the walls, illuminating a chamber filled with items that spoke of wealth and tradition. Golden urns, tapestries woven with intricate alien designs, and weapon racks lined the sides. In the center was a low table surrounded by cushions. The women moved with practiced ease, each taking a place around the table while the leader indicated a seat for Kale. He sat, his senses alert, aware that this was no casual meeting but something with purpose. One of the younger women, with bright, silver markings along her temples, spoke first. Her voice was smooth yet carried an edge, as though every word was weighed before being released. She asked him what he sought in their city. Kale replied that he sought only survival for now, but he was willing to work for what he needed. Her gaze did not leave his face, and he could feel her measuring the truth of his answer. Around the table, the others listened in silence, their expressions unreadable. The leader then revealed something unexpected. She told him that all 12 of them were bound by an ancient vow. They were warriors, advisors, and protectors of a bloodline that ruled this city in the shadows. The gladiator he had faced was not only feared for his skill, but also for his connection to one of the ruling factions. By striking against him, Kale had stepped into the weave of their politics, a web that was as dangerous as it was unyielding. She asked him if he would stand with them when the time came. Kale's answer was simple: if the cause was just, he would stand. The leader's lips curved into the faintest smile, a rare glimpse of approval. She looked to the others, and subtle nods passed between them. One by one, they began to share fragments of their history with him. Each woman's voice painted a different part of the picture: battles fought, sacrifices made, and betrayals endured. Kale listened, piecing together the understanding that these women were far more than their beauty suggested. They were survivors, forged in the fire of conflict. When their stories were done, the leader leaned closer and told him the unspoken truth. By saving the old woman, he had unknowingly fulfilled a sign spoken of in their traditions. It was said that a stranger who would one day unite them would first defend the weakest among them without knowing who she truly was. That old woman had not been a common vendor, but a former keeper of their order, living in disguise to watch the city from the ground. The realization struck him with quiet force. Kale felt the weight of their gazes once again, but this time it was different. No longer were they measuring a stranger, they were seeing someone who might play a role in their future. The leader rose, her robe flowing like liquid gold in the filtered light. She extended her hand to him, not as a gesture of command but as an offer. Kale took it, feeling the strength in her grip and the unspoken promise in her eyes. Whatever path lay ahead, it would no longer be one he walked alone. The courtyard beyond the chamber was filled with the scent of desert flowers and the sound of running water from a carved stone fountain. Kale followed the women into the open air, where the sunlight painted the high walls in shades of gold. The leader moved with a quiet confidence, and the others formed a loose circle around him as they walked. Every step felt deliberate, as if each pace forward was part of a ritual. He did not yet understand. They led him to a smaller gate on the far side, where two armored guards bowed their heads to the leader before stepping aside. Beyond the gate, the city stretched in layers of narrow streets, elevated walkways, and bridges that connected tall sandstone towers. The women guided him down a sloping path that passed under hanging banners, their colors bright in the sunlight. Kale noticed how people in the streets stopped to look at them, their eyes darting between him and the women with a mix of curiosity and caution. The path ended at a long stairway carved into the rock. At its base stood a tall structure with wide doors flanked by statues of alien warriors. The leader paused, studying Kale with an intensity that made him wonder if this was another test. She gave a short command, and the doors swung open to reveal a training hall lit by shafts of sunlight cutting through the roof. The air smelled faintly of oil and steel, and the walls were lined with racks of weapons both familiar and strange. Kale was led to the center of the hall, where a circle was marked on the floor. One of the women, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped into it, holding two curved blades. She introduced herself as Sira, the second among them, and said she wished to see if he was worthy of the vow they were considering. Kale took a weapon offered to him, a short single-edged blade that felt well-balanced in his grip. Around them, the others stood silently, their eyes following every movement. The fight began quickly. Sira moved with the speed of someone who had trained for years, her strikes precise and fluid. Kale blocked and dodged, testing her rhythm, his focus narrowing until the rest of the hall seemed to fade away. When her blade came close enough for him to feel the air shift, he countered with a swift parry that made her step back. There was no malice in her attacks, but the weight of her strikes carried the seriousness of the trial. He knew that this was not for sport, it was for judgment. Minutes passed in a blur of movement and sound. Kale began to adapt, recognizing patterns in her attacks and exploiting the smallest openings. At one point, he turned her momentum against her, forcing her to step outside the circle. She stopped, lowering her blades, and regarded him with an expression that was half surprise and half approval. Without a word, she handed him the blades and stepped aside. The leader's gaze lingered on him for a long moment before she spoke. Again, she told him that his skill was more than enough, but skill alone was not what bound their order together. Loyalty, honor, and the willingness to face danger without hesitation were the true marks of one who could stand among them. By stepping into the market against the Gladiator, and by standing his ground here, he had shown the heart they valued. The others nodded in agreement, though none yet revealed the full meaning of what they intended for him. As they left the training hall, Kale felt a subtle shift in the way the women looked at him. It was not the guarded curiosity from before, but something more like recognition. He was no longer just a stranger who had interfered in a fight. He had begun to earn a place within their ranks, though the road ahead promised trials far greater than what he had faced so far. The leader walked beside him as they stepped back into the sunlight, her expression unreadable yet steady, as if already thinking of the battles to come. The following morning, Kale was awakened by the sound of drums echoing through the stone corridors. He rose from the simple bedding that had been prepared for him and stepped into the hallway, where two of the women were waiting. Without speaking, they motioned for him to follow. The air was cooler than the day before, carrying the faint scent of burning incense from somewhere deep within the complex. The rhythmic beat of the drums guided them forward like a steady heartbeat. They passed through winding corridors carved into the rock, their walls etched with scenes of battles, oaths, and victories from ages past. Kale slowed his pace briefly to study the carvings, noting that many depicted figures resembling the women who now walked beside him. It was as though their faces had been carried through generations, immortalized in stone. One of the women noticed his gaze and told him in a quiet voice that the carvings were not just history, they were prophecy. The corridors opened into a wide, ceremonial hall filled with pale morning light. At the far end stood the leader, her golden robe trailing across the floor like flowing sunlight. Behind her, tall banners hung from the ceiling, each marked with a different symbol. The other 10 women were already present, standing in 2 lines that formed a path leading toward the leader. Kale could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he stepped forward. When he reached the center of the hall, the leader began to speak. Her voice was calm, yet carried a strength that demanded attention. She spoke of the vow that bound them together, of the dangers that threatened their city from within and without, and of the role they believed Kale was destined to play. Her words painted a picture of unrest brewing beneath the surface, of rival factions waiting for the moment to strike. She told him that by standing with them, he would not only gain their trust but also their enemies. Kale listened in silence, weighing her words. He knew that joining them would mean stepping into a conflict that was older and more dangerous than he could yet imagine. But he also understood that walking away would mean turning his back on the choice he had already made when he defended. The old woman in the market. When she asked for his answer, there was no hesitation in his voice. He agreed to stand with them, whatever the cost might be. The leader's expression softened, and she raised her hand. The women stepped forward in unison, forming a circle around him. Each one placed a hand on his shoulder, their touch firm and deliberate. The leader spoke a phrase in their language, and the others repeated it, their voices blending into a sound that filled the hall like a rising tide. Cale felt a strange warmth spread through him, as though their strength was being shared with him in that moment. When the vow was complete, the leader told him that from this day forward, he would not be seen as an outsider among them. They would stand with him as he had stood for one of their own. She also warned that their enemies would see this as a challenge and would respond quickly. He should be prepared for attacks that would come without warning, both in the open and in the shadows. Her words were not meant to frighten him, but to prepare him for what lay ahead. As the circle broke and the women stepped back, Cale felt a new sense of belonging settle over him. The drums outside had stopped, replaced by the distant hum of the waking city. Whatever trials were coming, he was no longer facing them alone. The leader met his gaze one last time before turning toward the hall's great doors, and Cale followed, ready to meet whatever the day would bring. The city streets were alive with movement as Cale and the 12 women stepped into the sunlight. Merchants called out their prices, children darted between stalls, and guards patrolled in pairs with eyes scanning the crowd. Yet despite the noise and color, Cale felt the tension beneath it all. He could sense the watchful gazes that followed. Them, some curious, others openly hostile. The leader walked beside him, her posture straight and unyielding, her eyes fixed ahead. They made their way toward the market square where Cale had first confronted the Gladiator. The memory of that moment still felt sharp, though now the square seemed different. Whispers rippled through the people as they recognized him walking in the center of the group. The sight of a human moving with the 12 women was enough to stir speculation. Some bowed their heads slightly as they passed, while others turned away, unwilling to meet their eyes. Near the center of the square, a group of armored men blocked their path. They wore the crimson insignia of the Gladiator's faction, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. The tallest among them stepped forward, his face partially hidden behind a metal mask. His voice was cold as he demanded that Cale answer for the insult dealt to their champion. The leader's gaze hardened, but she said nothing, allowing Cale to step forward. Cale's voice was steady as he told them that the only insult had been the Gladiator's treatment of an old woman. He would not apologize for defending someone too weak to fight back. The man in the mask tilted his head slightly, and a faint laugh escaped him. He promised that the matter would be settled in the arena, where no one could hide behind walls or words. The crowd stirred at the challenge, and Cale knew this was exactly the confrontation their enemies had been hoping for. The leader leaned close and told Cale that refusing would be seen as weakness. Accepting meant stepping into the heart of their enemy's power, but it would also show the city who he truly was. Cale met her gaze and gave a small nod. He agreed to fight, knowing the decision would bind him even tighter to the fate he had chosen. The masked man smiled behind the steel and promised that the arena would be ready by sunset. The rest of the day passed in preparation. Back within the safety of their compound, Sira and 2 others trained Cale relentlessly, forcing him to move faster and strike with greater precision. They tested his endurance, pushed his reflexes, and drilled him on the weaknesses of Gladiator armor. Sweat soaked his skin and his muscles burned, but he welcomed the challenge. Every strike of his blade brought him closer to the moment that would decide not just his life, but his standing among them. When the sun began to lower, they left for the arena. The massive stone structure loomed over the city, its gates wide enough for war beasts to pass through. The roar of the crowd grew louder with each step, and the scent of dust and oil filled the air. Inside, the arena floor stretched wide and bare, surrounded by towering walls lined with thousands of spectators. Kale walked to the center, his eyes fixed on the opposite gate as it began to rise. The gladiator emerged in full armor, the same crimson and gold plates glinting under the dying light of the sun. His massive blade rested easily on his shoulder, and his helmet hid any trace of emotion. The crowd's roar became deafening, but Kale heard only the sound of his own breathing. He tightened his grip on his weapon, feeling the weight of every gaze in the arena. Above, in the shadowed stands, the 12 women stood together, their eyes locked on him, waiting for the first strike to be made. The first strike came fast, the gladiator's blade cutting through the air with a roar of steel. Kale sidestepped, feeling the rush of wind as the weapon missed him by inches. He countered with a quick slash toward the gladiator's side, but the blow glanced off the thick armor. The crowd reacted with a mix of cheers and jeers, their voices blending into a single wall of sound. Kale kept his focus on the rhythm of his opponent's movements, searching for an opening that would not leave him exposed. The gladiator advanced again, his strikes heavy and relentless. Each blow shook Kale's arms when their blades met, forcing him to give ground. Dust rose beneath their feet, the sunlight catching the fine particles and turning them gold. Kale waited for a moment when the gladiator committed too much weight to an attack. It came when a sweeping strike overextended his reach, leaving the joint between chest plate and shoulder unprotected. Kale lunged, driving his blade into the gap, and felt the resistance give way. The gladiator staggered back, a growl of pain escaping from beneath his helmet. The crowd's noise swelled, some shouting in outrage while others cheered the human's daring strike. Kale did not press recklessly. He circled instead, forcing the gladiator to turn with him, making the injury work against his opponent's balance. The 12 women watched from above, their faces unreadable but their attention unbroken. Kale could feel their eyes on him, as if they were willing him to hold his ground. With a burst of strength, the gladiator charged, his blade swinging downward in a crushing arc. Kale dropped to one knee, letting the weapon slam into the ground behind him. He twisted and drove his shoulder into the gladiator's midsection, knocking him off balance. As the larger fighter stumbled, Kale used the momentum to push him further, forcing him into the arena wall. The sound of armor striking stone rang out across the arena, sharp and final. The gladiator recovered quickly, but Kale could see the strain in his movements now. The injury to his shoulder slowed his strikes, and his breath came heavier with each exchange. Kale pressed forward, striking at weak points in the armor, never staying in the same spot long enough to be caught. Each clash of steel sent vibrations up his arms, but he kept moving, kept forcing the gladiator to defend rather than attack. The crowd was on its feet, sensing the fight shifting. In a final desperate attempt, the gladiator raised his blade high for a two-handed strike meant to end the battle. Kale stepped in before it could fall, slamming his palm into the injured shoulder with all his strength. The gladiator roared in pain, dropping his weapon to the sand. Kale kicked it away and placed his blade at the gap in the armor over the gladiator's throat. The arena went silent, the air holding the weight of the moment. Kale's eyes locked with his opponent's through the narrow slit in the helmet. Instead of delivering a killing blow, Kale stepped back. He lowered his weapon and turned away, leaving the gladiator kneeling in the dust. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, others in wild cheers. Kale walked toward the center of the arena, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Above, the 12 women rose together, their golden robes catching the last light of the sun. The leader's gaze met his, and in it he saw approval mixed with something deeper, something unspoken. The announcer's voice rang out, declaring Kale the victor. The gates opened, and he left the arena floor with the roar of the crowd still echoing behind him. The women met him at the entrance, forming a line that closed around him like a shield. The leader stepped forward, her voice carrying over the din, telling him that his choice to spare the gladiator's life had changed everything. In the eyes of the city, he was no longer an outsider. He was a master to whom loyalty would now be given freely. The streets outside the arena were a storm of sound and movement as Kale emerged with the 12 women at his side. People pushed forward to see him, some reaching out as if to touch the man who had just bested the champion. Others stepped back, whispering to one another, their eyes darting between Kale and the leader. He could feel the shift in the air, respect from some, resentment from others, but all of it carried the weight of change. The leader guided him through the crowd without slowing, her steps sure and unyielding. The women followed in a formation that kept the press of people at a distance. Kale noticed that guards who had once watched him with suspicion now inclined their heads as he passed. Even those who frowned at him seemed unwilling to meet his gaze for long. The city's judgment had already begun to turn, and with it came a sense of responsibility that settled heavy on his shoulders. Back within the walls of their compound, the women led Kale to the same ceremonial hall where he had taken the vow. The banners hung still in the air, and the sunlight streamed in through the high windows, catching the gold thread in the leader's robe. She told him to stand in the center as the others formed a circle around him. Her voice carried across the space as she spoke of his victory, not just in combat, but in showing restraint where others might have sought blood. One by one, each woman stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking words in their own language. Though Kale could not understand them all, the tone carried weight and sincerity. When the last of them stepped back, the leader approached and rested her hand lightly against his chest. She told him that from this day forward he was bound to them, not by chance but by choice, and that his place among them was sealed. She then revealed the truth that had been hidden until now. The old woman he had saved in the market was the last living keeper of the city's deepest traditions, and her life had been the test that marked him as the one foretold. The 12 women, each a daughter of the bloodline, had been bound to remain unclaimed until the one worthy of leading them appeared. By his actions, Kale had fulfilled that ancient prophecy without knowing it. Kale felt the magnitude of her words settle over him, but he did not flinch from it. He looked at each of them in turn, seeing not just their beauty, but the strength and resolve that bound them together. He understood now that this was not a gift given freely, it was a responsibility earned through sacrifice. If they would call him master, it would be in the truest sense, one who protected and stood beside them, not one who ruled through fear. The leader asked if he would accept the bond fully, knowing that it meant sharing both their power and their enemies. Kale met her gaze and answered without hesitation that he would. A ripple passed through the circle as the women exchanged brief looks. The leader smiled faintly and raised her hand, signaling the completion of the bond. In that moment, Kale knew there was no turning back from the path he had chosen. Outside, the city still buzzed with the echoes of the day's events, but within the walls of the compound, there was only the quiet strength of unity. Kale stood among them not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The 12 women moved to stand beside him, their golden robes swaying as they turned toward the open doors. Together, they stepped into the fading light, ready to face whatever the coming days would bring.